Hello everybody, my name is Walter and this is episode 63 of my Redstone Commands Series. In this episode I want to cover user interfaces, or in other words, how players can interact with datapacks. Now first things first, let's talk about what user interfaces are in general. To put it simple, they are the point where a player can interact with, for example, a datapack. It's generally a bidirectional connection, meaning you can use it to trigger parts of the datapack or change values of certain settings. But it will also, usually at least, give you some kind of feedback whether what you have just done has succeeded or failed or caused an error or whatever. In Minecraft there are a couple of ways you can implement this. The most straightforward way is just using the function or the trigger command, or potentially even the schedule command, to directly activate parts of the datapack. A bit more indirect is using JSON text, for example as part of science with embedded commands, books, or just chat messages with the terror command. There is also the option to check for certain user interactions or actions and interpret those as commands for the datapack. For example, is the player standing in a certain position? Are they holding a certain item? Are they clicking with that item? And so on. And with that covered, let's have a quick look at the examples I prepared so you have a better idea what I'm talking about. So let's start with the simplest option, which is just using the function command. Over here, I'm executing as the nearest player, which would be me, basically, the function UI action. And if I do that, I get a chat message and a cookie. There's nothing else going on in there. Now, using functions is somewhat simple, but the main problem is if you allow your players to use the functions in your datapack, they can use any function in your datapack. Problem with that is, if they trigger the wrong function, the datapack may misbehave or break down or cause failures and so on. So that is not really safe. A safer option would be using the trigger command, because you can enable and disable trigger commands for singular players. And only if the trigger command is enabled for a player for a given trigger, they can actually trigger that one. So you have fine control over what the players are supposed or allowed to do. So for that, I prepared a function that is called UI trigger, which implements the trigger functionality in the background. And the trigger itself is called trigger objective and can be triggered by run trigger. Again, since this is per player, I need to execute as a player. And if I do that, you can see I get again the message and a cookie. But what happened in the background was completely different. So let's have a quick look at the involved functions. The first one is UI action, which is just a simple chat message and then a give command to give the player a cookie. No surprise there. A bit more interesting is UI trigger, which generally should be triggered using the Minecraft tick function tag. In this example, I've used a repeating command block, which also works, but if the command block is not loaded, then the function is not triggered, so keep that in mind. The first thing I do here is creating a scoreboard objective of the type trigger. If that already exists, this command line is simply ignored. Then I'm checking for players that have triggered that objective, and if I find any, then I'm running the UI action as that player. And then finally, I just need to reset and enable the objective. So I'm running for all players that have triggered the objective, the reset command, and then for all players, the enable command. Now, many players don't really know much about Minecraft commands. So for those, it's much easier if you embed or anchor your user interface in physical objects like blocks or items. A quite common example are signs with JSON text, where you have click events embedded in this JSON text. And in this example here, I've just put in the UI action function call. And you can see every time I click, I get a cookie. What I did here is basically just a click event with function UI action. In this instance, you don't actually need the execute as part, because if you're clicking on a sign, then you yourself are already the executor of whatever functions or commands are triggered. Signs also have the advantage that they have multiple lines and you can embed a different command in each line. So sometimes you don't even need multiple functions. You can just put in the content of a function as multiple commands in a series. If it's feasible, sometimes you need it in one function for various reasons. Very similar, you can also embed it as click events in JSON text in written books. Similar functionality. And again, you yourself are the executor. Another quite common option is using chat menus. So you have the tellrow command, again with JSON text, and can use that to trigger parts of your data pack via the chat console. But obviously, the chat is, or the chat message is not a physical object you can just put into the world. So you need some way to trigger it manually or automatically. Obviously, you can use the things from before, but there are a few interesting ways to do it. One is using the Minecraft load function tag to trigger it, or to schedule it, I should say, a second or two after the load of the world. A few seconds because the Minecraft load function tag is triggered before the chat window is actually active. So you need to wait a little bit. Another interesting way is using a proximity trigger. So what I have here is a armor stand, and if I get close to it, I get a chat message. And if I click on that chat message, I'm getting a cookie again. The chat message itself is again just this command here, or well, basically this JSON text more or less. And well, the proximity trigger I will show you in a moment, but there are also other ways you can trigger this. So you can also have, for example, a carrot and stick, and every time I click on it, while holding it in my hand, I again trigger the UI action. There are other ways, but basically everything, or anything you could say, that can be detected with an execute if or an execute unless can be used to, well, trigger parts of your data pack. And I almost forgot to mention what is inside of these two command blocks here. So the click trigger is just the function call, and the proximity trigger is a little bit more elaborate. I'm executing here as the nearest entity within 10 meters of type armor stand with a specific tag, so I'm not targeting the wrong entity. And at that position of that entity, I am finally running the UI prox trick. And with that, let's have a quick look at how I actually implemented the proximity trigger and the click trigger. First of all, here is the UI chat menu, which is again just a simple tellrow command with an embedded click event, which well triggers the UI action function. So no real surprise in this part. The proximity trigger is pretty simple. Essentially, I check for players within 3 meters. And if those players don't have the tag prox trick, so they are close, but they don't have the tag yet, then I run the function UI chat menu. That is just the detection of, do I need to trigger the function or not? Now, if I stopped here, then I would just spam the chat window as long as the players are close. This is obviously not optimal. So I am using this prox trick tag to only trigger it once. Subsequently, I have basically the same start again, so player is near, but doesn't have the prox trick yet, and then I add that prox trick. Now, I need just to make sure that the player can retrigger by getting distance and then getting close again. So what I'm doing is then I'm checking, okay, is the player further than the 3 meters in this instance and has the tag, and if the player has the tag, then I'm removing the tag again. That way, if the player wants to retrigger the chat window, then, or the chat message, then they just need to get a bit distance and then get close again. So that is how I like to implement a proximity trigger. Obviously, there are other nuances you can do here, but this is the general idea. And the click trigger uses a scoreboard objective, which actually checks how many times the player has used a carrot on a stick. That's the entire secret here. And if the player has used the carrot on a stick, that is obviously greater or equal than 1. And then I trigger the UI action, and then I'm just setting it forcefully back to 0. And that's already the entire secret. Again, the first line here gets ignored when the trigger already exists. And yeah, that is pretty much how you can implement a proximity trigger and a click trigger. I've heard rumors that with the coming up updates, there will also be ways to use predicates to directly detect when a player is right or left clicking. So yeah, this here is a workaround that may not be necessary in the future. And with that, we've reached the end of this episode about user interfaces. I hope you enjoyed it. I wish you a nice day, and well, see ya.